This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Anne Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Anne Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship just outside beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Our thoughtful bold leader today joins us from Harvard University in the city of Cambridge, just outside Boston. He never intended to become an academic, but serendipity and life intervened. He was born and raised in Pontiac, close to Detroit in Michigan, to Holocaust survivor Jewish parents. He is an American lawyer, economist, author, and academic university administrator. He also served on the Obama White House advisory boards to review America's historically Black colleges and universities. He spent 24 years at the prestigious MIT University. He is the former chancellor of MIT, the former president of Tufts University, and is a long-standing member of Harvard Corporation, Harvard's main governing body. He flunked retirement and became the 29th president of Harvard University, America's oldest learning institution, which continues to shape the American system of higher education. He was inaugurated on one fine day in the fall in Harvard Yard on October the 5th, 2018, 3 months after he took office. I proudly attended his inauguration. I felt emotionally moved by Amanda Gorman's touching tribute to him, but most notably, I am inspired by his humility, his humanity, and how he blends academic scholarship with presidential power and bold leadership. Stay tuned as we learn about his letters and discussions with China's President Xi Jinping, the changing landscape of higher education, why Mandela's leadership, in his words, is absolutely relevant today, and his message for Generation Z. We warmly welcome the 29th president of Harvard University, Lawrence Bacow, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. So Larry, it's such a joy and a privilege for you to come and share your incredible insights, your remarkable wisdom, and have this critical conversation on leading boldly into the future. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to begin with the definition of bold leadership. You know, shortly after your inauguration as Harvard's 29th president on October the 5th, 2018, it's a day, by the way, I recall so well in Harvard Yard. In 2019, shortly thereafter, you took some very big, bold decisions and actions. A couple of things come to mind. You went to China, you met with President Xi, you spoke at Peking University, you defended academic freedom, and you also read a poem at that time. It's an ethnic group, as we know, that has suffered grave human violations and human rights violations in China. You also in that year wrote to then Secretary Mike Pompeo and expressed your personal view about the Dreamers to ensure that these children who had arrived in the US were protected and not deported. And then I think the third initiative, Larry, that stands out so remarkably for me, in 2019, you also established an initiative for Harvard to take an introspective look at itself and its history with slavery. So my question is, what is the definition of bold leadership? What galvanized you to make these bold decisions?
So it's a good question, Anne. I'm not sure I can tell you what bold leadership is. I think that good leaders lead ethically, and they lead in ways that I think deeply reflect their own values. So let me, at least take, some of those questions or some of those situations that you've asked about. In terms of speaking out on behalf of dreamers, it was not just about dreamers. I've spoken out about immigration on a number of cases. That first year we had a freshman who was actually a Palestinian student who was educated in a Lebanese refugee camp. He came to this country, he was turned away at the border. I went to bat to try and get him back into this country, which we were successful at. During the pandemic, the federal government wanted to sort of require foreign students to go home if their universities went to remote instruction. There was the example of my speech at Peking University, where I quoted from a poem written by a Uyghur poet. All of those were motivated by one thing, and that was the experience of my mother. My mother was born and raised in Germany, in a small village of about 900 people. All of the Jews of Lundorf, this village, were transported to the concentration camps on the same day. And my mother was the only one who returned alive, lost her whole family. And, that's left me with, a deep appreciation for refugees, for immigrants, for those who want to come to this country in search of freedom or opportunity. And also a sense that in my position, I have an opportunity to give voice to the voiceless. And, with DACA students brought here as children, known only one country, to me, for them to be excluded or for those who wanted to try and make them go home, it just, I think, not only violated my fundamental sense of decency, but also, immigrants to this country have literally helped to shape this country and to make this country. So, and similarly, when I went to China and I spoke at Peking University, and I spoke to Xi on the same day that afternoon. I quoted from the Uyghur poet, because the Uyghurs have no voice in China. They have literally been sent to what are the equivalent of concentration camps today. So, my mother's experience, my father was also a refugee coming to this country, have shaped my view of what are my responsibilities, not just to immigrants, but generally those who have no voice. And that's what's motivated me in a number of things that I've done as president of Harvard.
What do you think the duty and obligation is for people sitting in those senior positions of power to give voice to the voiceless?
So it's another great question. Part of the problem of having succeeded in certain areas, like when I sued the federal government to keep foreign students in this country, and we were successful, and as a result, 1 million foreign students were allowed to stay here. It was interesting what happened after that. There were many people who then wanted me to go to bat on behalf of all sorts of other causes and groups. And one of the challenges is you really need to pick your spots. And I have acted in cases where there's a direct interest of the university. We had a direct interest in immigration. 25% of our students in this country come from abroad. In some schools at Harvard, the Kennedy School, Graduate School of Design, it's over 50%. 25% of our faculty were born someplace else. So we have a direct interest in seeing that our borders remain open to scholars, to visitors, to students from coming elsewhere. In the case of the Uyghurs, we actually had a student who had been admitted to Harvard as a graduate student who was being imprisoned, a Uyghur student, and a visiting faculty member who was supposed to come to Harvard, who was also a Uyghur, also imprisoned. So I felt some obligation to speak on their behalf. And in fact, when I met Xi, I left him with a letter referencing these two specific individuals and asking for him to look into their case and saying that we would gladly welcome them and accept them to Harvard if they could be freed. I do think, though, that if you speak out too much on every issue, that people start to tune you out. And so, and I think these days there's sort of been a vacuum of leadership in, at least in our country, within the federal government, certainly during the Trump years, and also more generally, given the divisions of this country in Congress. And I think that's put pressure on all leaders, whether or not one leads a university or one leads a great corporation, to speak out on many, many issues. And one of the things I always say is that there are a diversity of opinions at a place like this. And I have to be careful about speaking out on certain issues, because I always say on issues where reasonable people can disagree, the function of the university is create space where they can debate those issues. And if I take a position on one side or another, I don't encourage debate, I quash it. So, I mean, there have been many people who wanted me to speak out, for example, on behalf of Palestinians in the Middle East. But, reasonable people can differ on where the balance of equities lie between Palestinians and the Israelis. So that's the kind of issue where it's not helpful for me to speak out, but rather to encourage debate on our campus.
Yeah. And, I guess as part of that question, Larry, in that decision to speak out as you did in China, but what process did you go through in terms of assessing the risks? And what would you say to people out there who are trying to speak up and speak out, give voice to the voiceless, but there are very big risks involved? How did you assess your risk, if any, in speaking to Xi and speaking out in China?
Candidly, I did not think there was any risk to me personally. For better or for worse, when the president of Harvard, it doesn't make any difference whether or not it's me or anybody else, travels to certain regions of the world, and China is one of them, I'm almost treated like a head of state. And I knew there was, I was not going to be at risk personally. And candidly, I didn't think our relationship, as a university would be put at risk either, just given the status of this institution. So I did not see any risk to me personally. I also didn't think there was any risk to the institution, which is one of the reasons why it was easy for me to speak on this issue. I didn't think it was such a bold move to do so. There are other issues, though, that I've taken up the cause. As you probably know, we have a case pending before the Supreme Court. Race-conscious admissions, whether or not we consider race as one factor among many in constructing our classes here at Harvard. That's another one where we've sort of taken the lead on behalf of all of higher education. We've sort of stuck our necks out there, and many people have gone after us as a result of that. But again, I think it goes to the core of who we are as an institution, and I think our role in society as well. And I think I would not be doing my job if I did not stand up and speak on an issue like that. So, there may be some risk to the institution longer term. In fact, those in Congress have sort of reacted, at least some have reacted poorly to this. They've begun to tax our endowment in return, but I think one needs to do what you believe is ethically right.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point around Congress, and also your point around some of the challenges and developing the appropriate leadership that's going to meet this pivotal moment in the US and in the world today, If you were able to address Congress, what would you say to them about the future of leadership for the United States and the world?
I would say that our political process these days is driving people to the extremes, and the role of leaders is not to encourage that, but the role of leaders is to help lead in a way that brings people together. I always say that leaders tend to have a number of things in common. They see opportunity where others see only divisions. They're good at finding resources where others only see scarcity.
Yeah.
I think that there's a special role for all of us to play, not in dividing people, but in bringing them together and bringing them together in ways that allow institutions, organizations, countries to move forward productively. So
Yeah.
when I meet with new college presidents and they're seeking advice, I always say that the best advice I can give them is to always do what's right. It's usually not that difficult to figure out. It's often excruciatingly difficult to do. And that's when you really have to do it.
And has there been an instance where it has been particularly difficult? You alluded to the recent case with the Supreme Court. What process did you go through to arrive at the right decision for the right reasons?
Well, look, we have been on the forefront of defending race-conscious admissions for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
The history of this issue goes back, 40 years in terms of precedent in the Supreme Court. In all the other cases that have been brought up before the Supreme Court, we have not been the defendant, but in each and every case, the court, in deciding in favor of race-conscious admissions, has cited the admissions process at Harvard. Now, in this case, we are in fact the defendant. So it was not difficult to defend what we've done. We've taken positions on this before. It is the case, though, that since we are Harvard, the rest of the world is paying a lot more attention to what happens. It's fortunate in some ways that we are the defendant. We were, the plaintiffs chose us because of our position, but we also have the resources to fight against this case, to represent, if you will, all of higher education in ways that many other institutions would not. So I think that imposes upon us a responsibility as well.
Yeah. And alluding to the strength of Harvard and the institution of Harvard and the office, I'm curious, how did President Xi respond? A, to your request, and B, to your letter?
As you might expect, the letter itself did not have much impact. I got an answer from the Chinese ambassador to the United States, which said basically that China respects the rule of law and he can't intervene in an individual case. I've written him a couple times again asking for the status of this case. I've tried to keep it on the radar screen. She and I actually had an interesting conversation. And it was about how universities in times of tension between their host nations can often do things that governments cannot. And I argued in favor of, while our governments may have their differences, that it was important to maintain scholarly relationships and scholarly collaborations. And with that, he agreed. Actually, that's gotten more difficult since I went over there, in part because our government has attempted to put limits on our capacity to collaborate and engage with our Chinese counterparts. And that's something which I've also, tried to explain to our government why it's not in our interest to do that.
That's encouraging, actually. Thinking about the big challenges in this pivotal moment, not only in the US and in the world, Larry, I'm reminded of what you said in April 2020, that climate change is probably the biggest consequential threat facing humanity. I'm also aware that you've encouraged various actions across Harvard with multidisciplinary involvement to address the issue of climate change, to respond to the pandemic. In your mind, what are the biggest current threats that keep you up at night? What concerns you most?
So a number of things, and I've tried to ensure that Harvard is engaged in a productive way with all of the big issues of our time. So you've mentioned one of them, climate change. Another, I think that we are all wrestling with is the issue of inequality. The pandemic laid bare inequality, throughout our society, whether or not we're talking about inequality in income, inequality in wealth, inequality in access to medical care, inequality in access to justice, inequality to access to education, inequality in access to housing. So I think it's important for an institution like ours to be focused on issues of inequality and what we might do to address them mainly through our scholarship, but also through our teaching. Another major issue is racial justice in this country. We continue to deal with what is sometimes called in our country our original sin, and that is the way in which we embraced the institution of slavery early in the history of our country. Another important one is the future of democracy. I think democracy is literally under threat in every country that has embraced democracy in the past, and certainly in this country. And we cannot take that for granted. I think Harvard has a special obligation here because, on the day the Declaration of Independence was signed, we as an institution were 140 years old. The 9 signers of the Declaration of Independence were our alumni. We literally helped to bring this country into being. And so I think that imposes a special obligation on us to try and do what we can to preserve the institution of democracy. So that's another one where I think we need to be visible and on the forefront as well. So there are other issues, but if you ask me the big ones, climate change, inequality, racial justice, the future of democracy.
Yeah. And on the future of democracy, I mean, that is so heightened. What is it that you think institutions like Harvard and other higher ed institutions can do to help protect and maintain a stable democracy?
Well, I think our scholarship is quite important here. We have 2 faculty members in our political science department, Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, who wrote a very important book entitled How Democracies Die. And it actually looks at the history of, going back generations, hundreds of years in some cases, where there were democratic governments that ceased to exist. And they ask, what can we learn from this? And so they identify a series of things that are common to all of these.
I'm curious about your own educational and career trajectory, and it made me smile. I mean, you're so well qualified and so talented in so many multiple disciplines. I mean, you got an economics degree from MIT, a law degree from Harvard, a master's in public policy. I also believe at MIT you were the founder and first director for its real estate center, a professor of environmental studies, head of the Center of Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School, and then president of Harvard. And of course, you've been president of other, chancellor and president of MIT and Tufts as well. I guess my question, Larry, is this incredibly diverse, well-rounded, multidisciplinary formal education track record and experience. Was that a conscious choice? And, this rise to the top, as somebody once said to me, Anne, what do you really want to be when you grow up? I mean, was being president of Harvard the ultimate choice? How did you get there? Why did you take this trajectory? Why this journey?
None of it was planned. I always say to students, most of our careers are, a resultant of a series of fortuitous accidents. And the only way that you can understand a career truly is on the day you retire. You can look back and everything makes sense. I never imagined I would be an academic, actually. I was a student at the Kennedy School and at Harvard Law School when I got married. My wife was enrolling in a master's program at MIT. She was going to graduate a year after I did. I needed something to do for that time. And that's why I wound up getting a PhD from Harvard. I figured I'd continue my education. At that point, we both thought we were going to go work in Washington, D.C. It was the start of the Carter administration. I happened to have an opportunity to fill in for somebody who was on leave from MIT for 2 years. So I did that. It was an opportunity to go back to my alma mater. I didn't expect to be an academic. 2 years turned into 24 years. During my time at MIT, I had zero interest in academic administration. So I dodged being a department chair or a dean. And then I became chairman of the faculty at MIT. That's sort of leader of the faculty. It's considered an honor. Nobody says no. You're invited by your colleagues to do that. So I agreed to do that. As a result of that, I got to know the president and the provost quite well. After my term had ended, I went back into the faculty at MIT. The president asked me to become the chancellor of MIT. So split the job of provost in two. I got half with the title chancellor. A colleague got half with the title provost. I had zero interest in being a university president. But if you have the number 2 job at a place like MIT, you get called for every presidential search. And I kept saying no, I wasn't interested. And then for a whole variety of reasons that I don't need to go into, when Tufts called, I figured I'd have a conversation with them. And I wound up as president of Tufts. And when I came, I said I would do it for 10 years. I thought that was about the right amount of time. I did my 10 years. I stepped down. That's actually when I came to Harvard, first as the president in residence at the Ed School, and then as the Hauser leader in residence at the Center for Public Leadership. At the time, I also joined the Harvard Corporation, the governing body, fiduciary body for the university. We went looking for a new president. And when Drew Faust stepped down, I was on the search committee. There was a faculty advisory committee to the search. And at one point, the faculty advisory committee went to the chairman of the search committee and said, why not Larry? At that point, I said, no. It wasn't me. Been there, done that. And then there came a point where my colleagues on the search committee said, no, we really would like you. And so, I never looked in the mirror and saw myself as the president of Harvard. But it was, again, I saw this as an opportunity to serve and to serve an institution that had been good to me. I have 3 degrees from Harvard, but also to serve higher education.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Larry, I'm also reminded that soon after your inauguration in 2018, you made a trip down memory lane and you went back to Michigan, to the place of your birth and where you were raised in Detroit and Pontiac. What struck me, why that trip back down memory lane to your childhood? Why at that point in time? And what was a moment in that childhood that really struck a chord that shaped the Larry you are today?
So I grew up in Pontiac, Michigan, which was a gritty industrial town with 3 General Motors plants. I always say you could graduate from high school, Pontiac Central High School, on a Friday, go to work at one of the GM assembly plants, and be pretty much guaranteed over time a comfortable middle-class existence. Their kids would go to a good college, they would graduate without debt. When you retired, you would have a pension, health care benefits, you'd own your own house. That was all gone by the time I became president of Harvard. When I left Pontiac, it was a town of about 85,000 people. When I became president of Harvard, it was a town of 45,000 people. It had gone through bankruptcy, receivership. All 3 of the public schools that I attended had closed. So I consciously decided to make my first trip as president of Harvard back to Pontiac. And in part, I did so because I wanted to give the students of Pontiac the sense that, anything was possible for them. But it was higher education. It was education that was going to be their pathway
Yes.
if they were going to make something of themselves. And so I actually went together with the dean of our graduate school of education, and the two of us really talked to these students and actually to the teachers about how important their job was, and to the students about the opportunity that they had as well. So that's why I went back to Pontiac. I have to tell you, you asked me about my youth. I was very much inspired by my fourth and fifth grade teacher. Her name was Shirley Chandler.
Yeah.
And, not to sound immodest, but, growing up, I was a pretty good student. And I was one of the kinds of students who always had his hand up when the teacher asked a question.
Yeah.
And in fourth grade, Mrs. Chandler pulled me aside and said, look, I know you can answer every question in the class, but it's important to give your classmates a chance to do that. And it's important to listen to them, to understand what they have to say. And that's a lesson that's always stuck with me. The importance of listening to others.
Yes.
I think it's shaped the way I view my own place in the world, how I go about doing my business. And actually, at my inauguration as the president of Tufts University, I spoke about the importance of great teachers in our lives. And I said that I had been blessed by many great teachers. My undergraduate mentor, for example, won the Nobel Prize. He was there.
Fantastic.
All of my graduate thesis advisors were there. And I said at the time, but one of the best teachers I had in my life was also there. It was my fourth and fifth grade teacher, Shirley Chandler. And I actually had her stand, and it was a wonderful moment. And afterwards, when I introduced her to my really my mentor, who's responsible for me becoming an academic. This is Bob Solow, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. I remember saying to him, if they awarded a Nobel Prize for elementary school educations, Mrs. Chandler would have one of them. So I think teachers shape us. And, I've been blessed to have many great teachers in my life. And again, one of the reasons that I actually became an academic, became a teacher, was for the opportunity to continue that tradition with my students.
And how did you feel when you were back in those classrooms talking to teachers and those students?
It took me back in time. I told the students which high school, which junior high school, which elementary school I attended. I told them what street I lived on. The things that they could identify with. One of the challenges of being the president of Harvard is that the title always precedes you. And people have expectations of who you are. And I spend a fair amount of my time trying to, prick that bubble. And to the extent that the students were capable of seeing themselves in my journey, I thought that was important.
What a joyful time. Turning to a leader who, like you, believed in the power of education and famously once said that education was the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world, Nelson Mandela. I was curious to know, is there a moment that you recall, whether it's a movie you watched, a book you read, or a quote, or a clip from when Mandela received his honorary doctorate at Harvard? Is there a particular moment that stands out for you, Larry, that struck a chord around the example of Mandela and what he meant to you, and whether he shaped you in any way, and how you think, act, and lead today?
Well, I never had the privilege of meeting Nelson Mandela. I wish I had, but obviously I know his work, and I resonate with his commitment to and understanding of the transformative power of education.
Yeah.
I think there are a number of moments. One I've just described with Mrs. Chandler. Um, I also, where I grew up, I had never met anybody with a PhD until I went to college. And, I had a series of teachers um, in college and in graduate school who kept seeing more in me than I saw in myself. I've already mentioned one of them, Bob Solo,
Yeah.
who encouraged me to go to graduate school. Another one was somebody at Harvard who turned out to be my dissertation advisor, Mark Moore. And I remember when I was thinking about getting a PhD, I went to Mark, and I always thought the people who had PhDs were way up here, and I was sort of way
Yeah.
down. And I talked to Mark, and he said, "Of course you have what it takes to get a PhD." And again, my career has been blessed with people who have seen more in me than I've seen in myself. And I think that that's also the lesson of Mandela by virtue of how he led his life um, and what he succeeded in doing, um, both while he was imprisoned and having gotten out of prison.
Yeah.
That it's such an inspiring story that helps people to understand that if they apply themselves, if they're committed, in some cases committed to a cause, in other cases committed to making themselves better and giving opportunity to others, just as opportunity has been given to us. I think those are really, really important lessons. And I've benefited from that throughout my life. I could name the teachers who influenced me, not just elementary school, but junior high school, in high school. And I've actually maintained connections with most of them.
That's fantastic. And, in that vein, do you think Mandela's life and leadership and example are relevant today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that he serves as an example and as inspiration to many um, who have been challenged in some cases because they've been oppressed.
Yeah.
They may have been imprisoned, but the importance of um, being true to one's convictions, to one's ideals, but also I think what's extraordinarily important about his journey
Yeah.
is how he was willing to embrace those who had imprisoned him, his deep commitment to reconciliation, his
Yeah.
ability to understand that it was possible to bring people together
Yes.
who were deeply divided. And I think
Yes.
there's a lesson there, especially in these times of deep division for all of us. It's a lesson of hope. It's a lesson of what can in fact be done,
Yes.
especially when others are saying, no, it's a bridge too far. He was able to build that bridge.
Yeah. That's powerful. And as we know, Mandela ended up stepping down after one term. You have announced that you're stepping down at the end of June 2023 after 5 years as Harvard's president. Mandela also ended up having to retire from retirement. So I know that you and Adele had mentioned that you're looking forward to spending more time with your children and grandchildren. I'm curious around the next chapter. What is the next chapter? You have alluded to perhaps serving on some boards and writing some stuff, but tell us a little more about what happens in this next chapter of your life.
Well, I'll go back a little bit to when I stepped down from Tufts.
Yeah.
I had served 10 years from there and was planning, not to retire, but to lead a less scheduled life, one in which
Yeah.
I did not have responsibility for running a large organization. As I sometimes say, like Mandela, I flunked retirement.
Yeah.
Because, I wound up running an institution, with 26,000 students, with 20,000 employees, 12 teaching hospitals. It was not my intention. And I've already said, as you know, that life is serendipitous. I say
Yeah.
to students, be prepared to recognize opportunity when it walks up and hits you in the face. At this point, I'll be 72 when I retire. I'm not looking to run anything, a big organization again.
Yeah.
I think I can still be helpful to others as a counselor, as an advisor in a variety of situations. I do want to write a few things. I am looking forward to getting reacquainted with the concept of unscheduled time. But I could also see myself, if the governor asked me, to chair a commission or something like that, where I could be helpful, doing something like that. I served on a White House task force in the period between when I was at Tufts and when I became president of Harvard. So I can still see trying to make a difference, trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
But I also recognize that there's far more of my career in the rearview mirror than there is ahead of me.
Yeah. Well, I still think it's a very significant chapter coming up. And I know you've also alluded to the fact that you're invested in and have been, can and have been supportive of other new presidents of universities. I was curious to hear your thoughts, Larry, around what do you think universities and higher ed need to do to change the way we educate and develop our young generation of leaders to meet this moment?
So there's a perception that colleges and universities are ossified, they don't change. And I think that's a wrong perception. We do change. We just change over longer periods of time than people might imagine. But we do adapt. And it's one of the reasons why institutions like ours are among the oldest institutions in our societies. As I say, Harvard dates back to its founding in 1636.
Yeah.
And we would not be here today if we hadn't evolved and adapted. So I think you will continue to see us evolve and adapt, as are most other institutions. We learned a lot during the pandemic about how we can use technology to reach more students, to expand opportunities for others. I think that will continue to be the case. I think that we learned also about what subjects and areas we need to focus more on. I've already mentioned at least a few of them, which I think are essential to the future of not just our nation, but many nations: inequality, climate change, racial justice, the future of democracy. And there are those within our societies where we're pushing back against those initiatives. I think we have a responsibility to push forward. So there are big issues that we face as institutions. I think that if we are to continue to maintain public support, I think we need to find ways to bend the cost curve in higher education. If we fail to do that, not only will we price ourselves out of the ability, to provide opportunity to students who really need it, but also we risk all the public support for higher education. I think this is actually a challenging time for us because there are populists on the right and populists on the left who have determined that elite institutions are bad for society. We are among the most elite of the elite. But I also think that we have a lot to contribute. And so we need to, again, push back against those, but that will only happen if politically, not just us, but our country and others are capable of reclaiming the center. So we have to constantly work on that. And we are not alone in that. I think if you take a look at what's happening in Europe and in many of the democracies in Europe, you are also seeing this. And also in other parts of the world, which are wrestling with the tensions between fundamentalism on one hand and modernity on the other. How that gets resolved will be important for so much of the world. And again, we see that almost everywhere. We see it in this country. With the rise of the religious right and the willingness of certain institutions in our society to try and embrace and institutionalize a particular view of religion in our government. which scares many of us, and I think ignores an important clause of the First Amendment,
Yeah.
which says government shall not recognize the establishment of religion, it's the Establishment Clause, nor take any action to abridge the free exercise of religion. So, and resolving that tension, I think is quite important long-term for the preservation of our democracy and our traditions, but it arises throughout the world.
Yeah, that's such a valuable point. And I guess, what message would you give to the students of Harvard, to Generation Z, not only across the United States? What is your message to them about their role in the future of leadership versus what the world needs now?
Well, I would say that there have been other times in our history where we have been deeply divided.
Yeah.
All you have to do is to take a look at the 60s, the 1860s and the 1960s. And in each case, we found a way to bring people back together.
Yeah.
And I would tell them that they need to focus on how that's going to happen, because that really is what's going to shape their future. And in many ways, I understand how, current generation of students feel like, those of us in positions of authority have left them with a mess.
Yeah.
But, we're going to need them to engage, to work hard, to recognize that it's their responsibility to get involved and to work to repair this broken world that we find ourselves in, just as past generations have done that as well. So that's what I would say to them, that there's no more important thing that they can do to become active, engaged citizens. We need that.
Yes, that's
and we
powerful.
need them to do that.
Just a couple of fun facts. I'm curious, you and Adele have such a wonderful partnership, such a great, you present yourselves with as a formidable team. What would you say is the magic sauce?
I think it's to find somebody who always helps to make you better. And I think we try and do this for each other. I think it's also important to put the relationship first.
Yeah.
And unless you do that, you're going to put tension on a relationship. And so there's not a decision of any consequence that we've not made in ways that I think strengthen our relationship as opposed to put it at risk.
Yeah. And what is one thing that people seldom know about you?
That I can juggle.
Mm-hmm. Literally juggle.
Literally juggle, 3 balls up in the air doing this. Yeah, I learned how to do that writing my dissertation. I was, Adele at the time was in graduate school at MIT, and one day, I went with her there because it was on a Sunday, she had work to do. So I took my stuff and I went into the library, and I was working on it, and I took a break. And when I went downstairs, the MIT Juggling Club was there doing their thing. And I said, "How do you do that?" And they taught me how to juggle. So most people don't know that I can do that, but it's a good thing for juggling other things, like one's time.
That's fantastic. And I know you're a great runner. You've run a number of marathons. What is it about running, apart from the physical health and well-being? What is it about running? What does it mean to you in your life?
So I get my best thinking done when I run. When I'm wrestling with a hard problem, I go for a long run. When I need to write a paper or give a speech, I go for a long run and think about it. And then, I organize it, and then I come back and I write it down. So it's one of the few times in my life, my current life, where I get to be, by myself and really think about the things that I want, because the rest of the day is almost completely scheduled.
Yeah, absolutely. And Larry, in our final few moments, any final thoughts about the future of leadership and what the world needs now?
I think every generation has found its leaders, and it's important for us to find them as well. I was talking to one of the members of our corporation, David Rubenstein, recently about this issue. And David, I think, made a very insightful observation. He said, at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, this country had about 3 million people in it. And of those 3 million, half were women who were actually disenfranchised. They were not part of the process.
Yeah.
And of the 1.5 million that were left, a significant number of them were enslaved. So maybe we had 1 million people, who were really active in the political process. That 1 million people produced, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. I mean, one could go on.
Yeah.
Truly great people who helped to shape this world. And, now we're a country of 350. Where
Sure.
are the equivalent? And I think
Yeah.
that's what we need to do. We need to create incentives and urge young people and others to get involved in the same way that they got involved. They were
Yes.
all comfortable,
Yes.
economically in their lives at the time.
Yeah.
But they were willing to put that at risk, actually, to bring a new country into being, to do so by establishing a set of ethical principles for leadership and for governance, which continue to be relevant, I think, for today. So I think it's always good to study history and to think about the role that each of us can play in shaping it.
Well, Larry Bacow, thank you so much. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your wisdom, your insights. I'm super excited to see what the next chapter has in store for you. I look forward to reconnecting, hopefully on a boat sailing somewhere in the oceans here. But thank you for your remarkable work and for your gift, not only to the United States, but to the world.
Well, you're very kind in saying that. And thank you, Anne, for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you. Harvard's 29th president, Larry Bacow, reveals profound wisdom about power, about leadership, and the formidable combination of the two. People confuse power and leadership. There are people in powerful positions who fail to exercise leadership. There are people who exercise leadership who do not hold positions of power. But when we combine the two, we disrupt the system and effect change. Any of my friends, colleagues, or alumni who have shared this privilege of coming to Harvard University know that Harvard opens up the world because the world comes to Harvard. This global access is possible partly because of the exemplary, bold leadership of Larry Bacow. His boldness is fueled by his origin story, his deeply etched human values, and his fortified moral courage. It moves me deeply. His father's Holocaust escape from Belarus in Eastern Europe, his mother's miraculous Auschwitz survival, and her family's everlasting gratitude for the American promise to live the American dream. Systems thinking teaches us that in order to disrupt the system, we must disrupt the current balance of power. But how different this world will be when those in power use their power, like Larry Bacow, to disrupt the system itself. That is leadership. Larry Bacow used his presidential power and exercised bold leadership to disrupt the system, to give a voice to the voiceless, and to give everyone a seat at the table. His letters and conversations with China's President Xi, citing a Uyghur poem at Peking University, requesting former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to give the American dreamers a legal pathway to immigration, and securing the legal rights for Harvard International students to continue at Harvard during the global pandemic lockdown. He steps down as Harvard's 29th president on June the 30th, 2023. It is no coincidence that Harvard has opened the door during his tenure to Claudine Gay, the first African-American woman to become a Harvard president in almost 400 years, to become the 30th Harvard president, and to gain a seat at this magnificent table. Thank you, Larry Bacow, for flunking retirement, for coming to Harvard and touching my life. More significantly, thank you for using your presidential power, for combining it with your bold leadership to disrupt the system, to leave a lasting leadership legacy, and to reshape the higher education system in the United States and the world. You too can use your power to exercise leadership, to disrupt the system, and to effect change. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. Take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog, and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.